Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar with George Friedman, who never disappoints to offer thoughtful and daring looks to the future. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Our members may recall that this discussion was previously scheduled to be co-sponsored and hosted at Dallas Baptist University. So let me now take this opportunity to especially thank Dallas Baptist University's President, Adam Wright, for his support, and to say as well, Adam, I sure do look back. I look forward to when we're going to be back on your beautiful campus. Now, just a few things to keep in mind before we begin the discussion with our guest, George Friedman. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we ask that your questions are succinct and that the Q&A submission box be used only for question submission. Please, no conversations or comments here. You can send them later. I especially want to welcome supporters of Interabang, our Dallas independent bookstore. You can always order from them books by authors featured on our calls by going to interabangbooks.com. And by the way, they're now offering free shipping. Without the foot traffic that they used to have, you know how important your order will be, and it'll certainly be appreciated. So I hope you'll order your book today. To those who have followed George Friedman's career, first at Stratfor, the firm he founded in 1996, and now at Geopolitical Futures, established by him about 5 years ago, you know that his prognostications are both bold and astonishingly accurate. Few are better at taking lessons from the past, evaluating the present to predict the future. The author of 5 books, his most recent, published just last month, is titled The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, the Coming Crisis of the 2020s, and the Triumph Beyond. George, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Really looking forward to this conversation, and it's always a pleasure to have you with the World Affairs Council. Let's begin, if we can. There you go, now I see you. George, let's begin with you giving us just really the background on this book and the premise.
Well, the background of this book is that it began in a bar in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in about 1975. And I was sitting with a couple of colonels, and if you've known colonels, nobody can complain more than a colonel. And we're talking about the catastrophic situation we've been in, the loss in Vietnam, the resignation of Richard Nixon, violence, assassinations, and everything else. And as they pointed out, there's never been a time so terrible. There's never been a time when it's really hard to imagine how the Republic will survive. And my view sitting there with them was that, yes, it's a bad time, but we got through the Civil War. So then I began asking the question, how often do we have times like this? And the answer turned out to be, well, there's this regularity. There are cycles that take place. And this was actually, if you look backwards, a predictable cycle. And I then said to no one in particular that, well, for example, this cycle will end in 1980. There'll be a new president who will take us in a new direction. He'll be reviled, but he will take us to this different place. Well, about 5 years ago, as I saw the system starting to crack again, the way I remembered, I took my notes from that out. I wrote up at a typewriter and took them out. And that was the origin of this book, because this book is about the cycles that drive American history and the psychological catastrophes that happen at the turning points. I don't hear you.
What led you at this time to write the book? I mean, you said, it was a number of years ago that you got the idea, but you've written a number of books in the meanwhile.
Well, if my theory was right then, about 2020, a little before then, we would start entering a period of instability, not too different from what was in the 60s. And that instability would be drawn by a number of factors, ranging from economic, to social, intellectual, to technical, a range of things would be converging. And as they converged, the old system wouldn't know how to handle it. So they would become rigidly conservative. And just as Ronald Reagan came in and blasted apart the conventional wisdom on how to govern, or before him Roosevelt did, it was time for that moment to happen again in 2020. So I began in 2015 to write this book. That begins just before 2020, and I wanted to explain for once, and no one was going to listen anyway, this isn't that bad. There are lots worse times than this is, and that we develop because of this. That the United States is an invention, an artificial thing, and it's like a machine, and it goes through cycles, and we're at that point.
You know, we are definitely going to talk about the coronavirus, and I can already see some questions coming up on that. And let me encourage our listeners to send in questions, and we'll get to them throughout our discussion. One of the things, George, that I've found especially interesting about your book is that you really perhaps don't put as much emphasis on the role of the President of the United States. And I found that surprising.
Well, the President of the United States is the weakest political leader in the Euro-American world. Parliamentary systems where a prime minister has a majority of his party, he's virtually a dictator. The President of the United States has two houses, two parliaments, essentially, arrayed against him, and a legal system so massive and intrusive that it can stop virtually anything he does. There's a wonderful paradox, which is we look to the president as the father who will solve all our problems, without realizing how little power he actually has. I remember, well, I don't remember, but FDR had to try to figure out how to pack the Supreme Court to allow him to have the New Deal. So he is a creature of history. He is thrown up by massive forces. Donald Trump was thrown up by this coming crisis, and what was seen by at least a substantial part of the country incapable of recognizing what was happening, how terrible things were for them. We saw him have a great slogan, make America great again, which America said, what is he talking about? Why make it great again? Well, because for vast numbers of Americans, American greatness had slipped. And so we look at that and we say, what does the president do? The president expresses the reality of the moment, but in terms of actual power to act, he can only act when he builds coalitions. And there are certain points in history you can't build a coalition.
Let's talk about what brought President Trump into office. And one of the things on page 139 of your book, you have a graph that shows household income stays flat. And you really talk about the frustration of lower income that could no longer see perhaps the pathway to having a comfortable house, being able to take, as you say, a short vacation. Go ahead and elaborate a bit more on that.
Well, firstly, we have to remember that the people we're talking about were the heart of the American industrial system. They were well paid. They had all these things. It is far more tense when you lose these things than when you never had them. In the event, this movement of industry to China, the development of an entirely new technology that they couldn't understand, left them in a position of decline up till the point where the income of the median income of the lower middle class is $35,000 a year. And these were people who were earning substantially more. At $35,000 a year, you take home maybe $2,600, $2,700 a month outside of California. Well, what happens to these people? They're expected to go quietly into that good night. In fact, they engaged in addition, and this is very important, a culture war where they belonged to the Baptist Church or the Roman Catholic Church or whatsoever, who taught certain things. Okay, and these things were from another class regarded as xenophobic or homophobic or Islamophobic. In other words, it was not a subject on which you could disagree. It was a subject in which you were mentally unstable, phobia, if you held a view. Well, the level of alienation of this group was substantial. And this group looked at uh, Hillary Clinton, who called him deplorable, and I think she lost the election at that point, who looked at Hillary Clinton as a monster. And so this was the core of Trump's presidency. But I want to add to this. If you look at an electoral map, it's very interesting. Clinton was very powerful on the West Coast and the Northeast. Between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians, only 3 states went for her: New Mexico, Colorado, and Illinois. So the split here is geographical. The 2 coasts are the coasts that are dynamic and growing. The center of the country houses these people. And what really happened here was a rebellion by the dispossessed, to give a purple explanation.
When you look at what might be the next cycle, how does this industrial class look at what you call the technocrats?
Well, the that is just fine because it involves both the institutional cycle and the social cycle. World War II created a class of people that gained an enormous legitimacy in managing World War II. These were experts from business, experts from physics, experts everywhere. The Manhattan Project kind of personified this. The idea that this class had a particular right of rule was what emerged in World War II. And for a very long time, they did extremely well, both in corporations and private life, at universities, everything else. The experts managed well. But as these things grew, the experts ran into a problem. Experts are by definition narrow. They know one thing very well. Okay? They're hedgehogs. And in being that, all right, they sometimes don't see the whole. Or they make the entire matter so complex that no one comprehended. They dig so deeply into their area, and the person in the next cubicle digs so deeply in their area, they wind up with this paradox. Social Security, one of the most important events in American social history, was 15 pages long. The entire healthcare regulatory manual is about 15,000 pages long, and part of it contradicts itself because there was no overarching common sense bringing it together. So you've reached a point at this point that the technocrats have done 2 things. First, they have created a level of complexity that goes counter to a principle of democracy the public has to understand. They also have created another reality. In the First Amendment, rarely mentioned, is the right to petition your government. That is to ask for things. Lincoln used to welcome people into his office on certain days to petition him, to ask for favors. It is almost impossible to petition your government. Who do you ask? The people who are at the desk at the front have no right to make decisions. They have regulations written. The regulations don't anticipate the problem you have. And so you're in a crisis. The federal government increasingly is enclosed, and at the same time, increasingly unable to build coherent policies. So all of our cycles begin with success, and the success goes forward and forward and forward until it no longer functions, and we replace it. At this point, the federal government whatever it does is so complex and difficult to navigate that it takes an expert to do it. And an expert only says, well, I know what I know. I don't know what anybody else does.
And is that not perhaps what we're seeing with the coronavirus?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, we have the coronavirus is in the hands of medical experts. They say that they cannot produce a vaccine in under a year and a half at the earliest, that there is no medicine. Therefore, what we should do is maintain social distance, perfectly acceptable. They don't consider, and it's not their responsibility, to consider the consequences of social distance. How do you run an economy if people are afraid to go shopping? Obviously. How do you raise a 10-year-old child in a 3-room apartment for 7 months? Well, that's not their job. You were asked to solve the problem, and this was the solution. And the problem is that they're experts, and because they're experts, they can't be challenged. And other segments have not come up with solutions. So Dr. Fauci, who is a very enticing and nice man, okay,
And an
sets the
expert.
rules. And an expert, of course, he draws on expertise, and he has us in a position to raise the question, what happens if we get a depression? What is the psychological damage of being afraid of everyone you see? Now, there may be no solution, but no one's thinking about it.
So it really comes down, though, as you say, to the complexity of the government. And when you look at the next cycle, what will, in a sense, turn that?
Well, the beginning of any cycle is that the institutions stop working, okay? They stop doing what they're supposed to do. And there are two ways we can see this. One, that the 1980s, the rise of the microchip economy, okay, is reaching maturity. It's not collapsing. It's not going to go away. It's reaching the point of maturity. It is 50 years old, about the same age as the automobile was in 1965. In other words, we have reached the end of the cycle. It's not high tech anymore, although we are obsessed with it as we were with the automobile at the time. The second problem is you can really see happening in universities. There are many things happening in universities, but this one is particularly important to me because in the 1920s, universities were entities in which only the right sort of person was admitted, and that not includes whatever, okay?
And then we had the GI Bill.
And we had the GI Bill, which blew that
Later.
apart, expertise celebrated, and went forward. And now we're back, Harvard has had, they've probably changed it by now, a questionnaire to be asked by people sitting on committees for admission. Is this the sort of person you'd want a room with? Is this the sort of person you'd like to have dinner with? Is this the sort of person whose company you'd enjoy? Well, that gets me out of the Ivies right away. I'm not going to be going there. But more to the point, imagine a young woman from Arkansas who's anti-abortion and whose ambition at Harvard is to start an anti-abortion movement. The chances of her being someone you want a room with, in other words, what they've done is our sort of people should be admitted. And what we've seen in some of the various scandals here has been really the enclosure of the factory that creates experts. Experts are generated by the university. Along with expertise now is an ideology, and that's not the problem. Universities always have ideology. But the selectivity of the 1920s has returned. And right after that, usually the university is blown up and rebuilt.
And you also talk in your book just about how expensive American universities are, one for the students and the infrastructure, compared to European universities. Do you think that we will perhaps ease our way more towards the European model?
Well, we have $1.6 trillion in student loan debt, for which there's a movement that they will not repay it. Interesting. Um, that is an unsupportable level. It is higher than subprime loans. It's guaranteed by the government. It gets more complex, but this is how the university maintains itself, why it can continually increase salaries and so on, which is that it has a entree into the federal government via the student loan system that adjusts itself as the salaries, as costs go up. But the point is, if you take a look at a university, they're located in parks in the United States, sometimes the most expensive land in a city. Columbia University on the Upper West Side has got to be able to realize several $billions based on the land. I went to Cornell. It was wonderful. It was beautiful. I enjoyed it greatly. I also went to CCNY. It was rotten. It was miserable. There was nothing I learned at Cornell that I didn't learn at CCNY. That is, they're both excellent schools. You have teachers, you have desks, you talk. We have the most lavish infrastructure for universities. But that goes back beyond the cycle. That goes back to how we envision the university and land-grant colleges and things like that.
Mhm. Before we move to some of the questions, I want to ask you as well about how you see the next cycle and some of the trends, particularly about life expectancy, expanding life expectancy, and how that's changing the relationships with institutions as well as family, and in a sense, as you write, is putting pressure on the younger generation.
Technology normally arises when you need it. When we started to industrialize cities, it was unlivable without electricity. You need lights. Thomas Edison was extremely smart. He didn't invent electricity, but he invented marketing the electricity, and he did changed it. As the country expanded and land had to be used, the automobile became an instrument of land use expansion. It created the suburbs, but it also allowed us to get out of what had become unlivable cities because of the industrialism. After World War II, the basic problem we had was two problems: managing information and more efficient transmission of information than television gives you. Television dominated and wasn't very efficient in getting to you. The microchip solved that. It was a core technology out of, we're on Zoom here, and it came out of that and all of these things, and it was wonderful. So what is the problem that faces the next generation? Well, it's simply this. Life expectancy is increasing. Mitigation of the diseases of old age, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc., is not proceeding at the same rate. At the same time, birth rate is dropping in the fertile class. We call them millennials. Okay? So we're winding up in a situation where power is going to be in the hands of the old simply because they outvote the young. We're already seeing that in some ways. Okay? But also they are killing the economy because the pressure they are putting on the economic system by being alive and unhealthy is serious. So the next obvious necessity, since we can't compel young people to have more children, okay, I think, um, and we're not going to kill older people, I hope. It's be very unfortunate, I think, personally. Therefore, we have to have solutions for old age and its infirmaries. One of them is medical. We have to find cures for certain strategic diseases. Okay, and we can think in terms of disease as strategic. There are some that have fundamental attacks on society. Old age, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, the care we give, and so on, viciously expensive. And also, we have to be able to mitigate it. So two things come to mind. One, a follow-on from the microchip era, robotics. That is, robotics to aid the old. But more importantly, breakthroughs in understanding old age, which I see articles in newspapers always. I never understand them, but they're there. And also curing certain critical diseases. So what I see is uh, a very odd society in which the older are living longer, the younger are not reproducing at sufficient rates, and a strange imbalance, it turns out.
But clearly, George, with what's going on now with COVID-19, it's putting massive pressure on our health system. I think we can say at least it is failing. So how do you think, what lessons may we learn that are realistically could be implemented from
The
this
most, the
experience?
most important lesson we need to learn, these things happen, guys. There are viruses and there are epidemics, and they're going to be periodic. And when they come, we will blame everybody for not preparing it. Will never cross our minds either. The second issue is to understand that you cannot have an absolute commitment to the medical dimension without considering the consequences in other dimensions. So the solution that we've been given, social distance, makes perfect medical sense. How do you run an economy on this? And what happens if the economy fails? How do you maintain the man as a social being? How do you maintain social life under these circumstances, especially when the doctors can't give us a terminal date for it? So what we've learned here is that somebody has to be sitting on top of the system. And sometimes you do what I call calculated risk. Yes, I understand that some people will die from this, but they will also die living in Hoovervilles, freezing to death, as in the Great Depression. So we have to look at the various costs. We hate making decisions based on cost of life. We do it all the time, but we hate making them. So when the doctors say, this is the only way I can save people, nobody says, you're not going to save people. You don't know how to cure the virus. When they come out, they'll catch it again, second wave. And then they'll say, well, they shouldn't come out. And then we have a discussion. And the problem that we have here is we don't have a balanced view of risk. And that's really difficult at this point.
George, it won't surprise you that the questions we have go across the spectrum, recognizing what you write about and have written about. So let's start with this one from Ray Termini. And let me also say that I'll be asking some questions and won't be able to identify you by name if you registered through DBU, because that was a different system. So I'll just say a question from DBU. But going back to Mr. Termini's question, you have written about the future fragmentation of Russia and China. Would you explain your reasoning and whether the virus has escalated or changed your views?
It's escalated it, but not changed it, in the sense that Russia is a third world country. It survives on almost 30% of its economy exists on oil exports. It does not control oil exports, which it tried to fight with Saudi Arabia. At this point, it's fallen oil prices into the mid to low 20s, and this is tremendously pressing on Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1980s, there were two things forcing it. One was increases in defense spending to try to keep up with the United States on Star Wars. The other was the fall in oil prices. They have increased their defense spending, or claim to have. We can't read that too well, okay? But now you have, once again, the fall of oil crisis. Not surprisingly, Putin tried to declare himself emperor for life. Now, in a healthy, normal society, this would not be a pressing need. Interestingly, he withdrew the suggestion. So when crazy things like that are happening at the top, watch out. In the case of China, China exists in two modes. Between 1848 and 1947, China was highly fragmented, waging a civil war against itself constantly. From 1948 to this present day, it has been a unitary state. This is not the normal state or the abnormal state, it's a cyclical state. It goes back and forth between the strong emperor and the weak emperor. In this particular case, the essential problem of China, with leaving aside the coronavirus, is that the coastal region is more attached to the United States than it is to Beijing. They make their living selling to us. The interior is still vastly impoverished. Beijing balances between these various forces, but we saw recently a number of problems, such as Hong Kong, Xinjiang. But the most important one was the United States deciding to impose tariffs on it. The United States imposing tariffs on it struck at the heart of the entire Chinese economy, which is the Chinese economy must have export markets. Its industrial plant is too large. Its industrial plant is too large to be bought by Chinese, either export or not. And Trump went directly after the jugular, which was not the South China Sea or such thing, a tariff. And interestingly, what Corona did was bury that issue to the great relief of the Chinese. And certainly Trump is not thinking in the multiple lanes right now. So that's gone. But China has a great deal of trouble remaining unified when the economic interests diverge. And that's what's happening now.
So one of our participants from DBU says, are we then putting too much emphasis on a potential threat from China?
Oh, yeah. So there are two forces in the world that want China to be seen as a great power. One is China, the other is the Department of Defense. The greater the threat, the more likely it lands. And my son, who is in Space Command, I was joking, how come at budget time you always find a new Chinese satellite? It's amazing coincidence. Look, DoD does what it has to do, okay? But China itself has, at this point, managed to have two navies, two carriers. Its biggest problem is it's never had an admiral who's fought a carrier battle. So when you look at the war, we were looking at, we're studying the Russo-Japanese War. The Russians lost because they didn't know how to command a complex force. The Japanese did. They learned it from the British, from whom they bought their fleet. So the Chinese decided to do their own fleet. They have no history of naval combat. And the United States is deeply steeped in that history. And therefore, you look at their power and you say, okay, who's the commander? The same thing that Stalin asked of us at before D-Day. He didn't want to hear about all the forces we had. He wanted to know who's commanding. Mm-hmm. And that's the right question.
So we have a question from Scott Mashburn. And Scott asks, regarding U.S. hegemony, can we continue to aspire to be the premier liberal democracy with all the military apparatus that costs so much lives, capital, money, and damage, and he adds, to the environment? And second part of his question, will the position of the United States change in the world as a result of the pandemic? And just, I would add to that to ask you to comment on, we're seeing China perhaps taking advantage of this situation by stressing its soft power in a role that the United States once had.
Well, I'd like to say soft power is what you stress when you don't have hard power. And I won't make any further jokes along these lines. The United States did not aspire to become a great power. It emerged into that role through World War II, the Japanese attack in Germany. It found itself in that role. It's never really been comfortable in it. There's been many forces in the United States that want us to back off, to which the question is, how do you do it? As to defense spending, it's a fraction of it was in the Cold War. And as to the damage to the environment, well, all I would say is if the United States weren't a major force, somebody else would be with the same equipment. I'm not sure it would matter very much to the environment. So my view on this is that nations do what they have to do. There's no grand plan. I've been in government, and I can assure you there's no grand plan for anything. We emerged. It happened. And it bothers us a great deal because we were the country founded against imperialism. We fought a revolution. 1% of all men died in that revolution. It was an extraordinarily bloody war. And we've always been uncomfortable. That's why we've looked at basically those people who wanted to be isolationists dominated until the world came after us.
So Miles Zitmore asked, I think, a very intriguing question. So what happens when the people who have been economically marginalized by the tech revolution, and in parentheses, some who might have voted for Trump, collide with the further disruption of AI, artificial intelligence, and the future disruptions of climate change? As Miles says, sounds like a recipe for an even more toxic social culture.
Social culture is no more toxic than we had in the 1970s or in the 1920s. One of the things we were talking about before, the interesting thing about Americans is they always believe the time they're in is the worst of times. And when we go back, you want really bad times. The Civil War was really toxic. The struggle between the Republicans and Democrats during the Great Depression was bad. We have this. It's not particularly unique. So what was the question again?
I've got to scroll down and find it, but basically,
Sorry.
is this culture that we're living in now different than what you had in prior periods?
It is different
And how do
in detail.
universities adapt?
It's in detail. It's different in tap. Artificial intelligence is something I worked on extensively in 1989, believe it or not, trying to create war games. And we were using Lisp and Prolog and all these computers. It didn't work. The Japanese bet all their money on artificial intelligence in those days. MIDI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, said, we will do artificial intelligence. Well, they were early. I've reached a point of cynicism where I can honestly say I have no idea what you mean by artificial intelligence. How do you create an artifice of something you don't understand? I've reached the point where you say, I don't understand what intelligence is. How do I model it? So, yeah, we're going to see more powerful programs, and the marketing people can call it whatever they want. As for what's going to happen with global warming, I don't know. I know what's going on. I also know that the models that are being used to forecast it aren't very good. We don't understand how climates work, which means the situation can be much better or infinitely worse. But the fact is that, one, the climate is warming. Two, it is a result of human activity. Three, there's no model that doesn't allow you to have some positive outcomes, like a garden of Eden in Sahara. I don't know what it is, but I do know that when I look at the climatic models, which have to precede this, they're not good. So, I mean, that's a huge problem, compounded by the fact that in a country where everybody is allowed an opinion, everybody has one. Personally, I'm confused.
And when you look at many other books written by geostrategists and futurists, there's usually a chapter on climate change, and yet you almost apologize in your book for not writing one or two chapters on it.
I don't know. I mean, my life began in the field of operations research, which is a mathematical modeling field, and it was a field in which we built models. So one of the things that I do when I forecast geopolitical events, so I have a model that I work from. It's cranky and old and everything, but it works, like me. Problem here is that the models that I've looked at closely all concede, the guys, in their publication concede, there are X number of variables that we can't operationalize, or we don't know the number of variables and so on. So we have only a rough idea, and I wasn't going to come into a book and say, okay, this is my position on global warming. I'm opposed to it. Okay, now what? In order to fix it, you have to know what the problem is. We've all decided that the problem is hydrocarbons. Probably true, okay? But there seems to be a whole lot of other variables. And so I decided that in this book, I'd punt. And I'd put it in the back of the book and hope nobody would notice.
Well, certainly lots of other people are covering it. We have a question from Laurie, and before I read her question, let me say that we are getting a number of questions from DBU and others, really wanting to hear from you about when you think industries might recover from the coronavirus. So I'll read Laurie's question and then ask you to go ahead and extend on it. Laurie says, dependence on China and US supply chain now broadly is known. What changes, if any, do you anticipate after the virus has ended?
Well, what has happened now is very interesting, which is the EU has stopped to exist. It ain't there no more. I mean, they might still be having dinners and whatever, but it's not there. The decisions in Europe on what to do are being made in Berlin or Warsaw or Budapest or Paris or what have you. The nation state has now resurrected the borders, blocked people in complete violation of the basic principles of free movement of people, okay? So what we've had here is, add to that a border between the United States and Canada, which I still haven't figured out, but I guess they felt better doing it. The borders are going back up. Now, the second thing that's happening along that is, in this I got speaking to a German today, it hit him how vulnerable Germany is being dependent on the Chinese for various things. There's a concept in geopolitics called autarky. The old concept that you had to be self-sufficient in all critical things. That went by the wayside after World War II to the notion of mutual interdependence. The question for me with this virus, I've seen viruses before. I've never seen a moment of such radical reversal of internationalists into operational nationalists. All the borders have gone up in Europe. In the case of Europe, usually what happens afterwards is artillery fire. But I assume we're quite a ways away from that. But I don't know if the EU reemerges again. It's not making any decisions. Nobody's paying attention.
But when you look at the EU or in China, as Laurie was asking about, I think what makes this situation different is you really have stopped human movement, or you're making that effort to do so. And when you no longer have essentially you have truck traffic in the United States, and there's even now questions, about whether trucks can go from one state or the other. That may be the next step. And as you wrote today in your own newsletter about the borders, and that's what's different now. And
Yeah,
how do you see that resuming? I mean, one of our questions is about how quickly do you think that we'll begin to see free air traffic?
Donald Trump keeps talking about April 1. A lot of people are talking about May 1, I should say.
May 1, yeah.
May 1, yeah. And the reason is the damage we're doing to the economy is substantial. It has been mitigated by a preposterously large decision to fund 10% of the GDP of the United States has gone into this. And as you would imagine, something whipped together like this, it may not work, but they're trying to bridge it. They can't bridge it again. You can't go for another 2 or 3 months without businesses closing, unemployment soaring. Just the airline industry alone employs about 700,000 people. And in addition to that, that's to support them, probably make up another 500,000 I don't know, what it is, but it's maybe 2 million. They'll go down. They're not going to be able to sustain themselves. Your shareholders will not want those losses. So we don't have a whole bunch of time. We have set ourselves a solution that can't work in that frame of time. So we're going to have to make a decision. We can have a depression. I don't want to overstate it, but that's what it is, and hold this for six months. Or we can accept that we'll have a certain number of deaths of this virus. There's never been a virus, including the pandemic of 1917, whatever it is, Spanish flu, where the solution was to isolate everyone. This is a first, and it's unsustainable. So I would suspect that come around May 1st, the argument will become, well, we can't keep going with this. There are going to be some people dying. That's the way it is.
Who do you think will make that decision, though, George?
The American public, who are, look, for a certain point of time, depending where you live, you can stand it. If you have two 10-year-old kids and you live in a 3-room apartment in Manhattan or Queens, or that's more likely, okay? Their lives are being completely thwarted by not being able to go out. Your life is, you're considering suicide. And there's jobs and work and money to be made. So the cost, the ugly thing that I'm going to say is the cost of saving those lives may be more than we can afford to pay. And I don't like that because I'm over 70. And I think all society should have as its primary goal my health. But in case I can't get that, we are facing somewhere in the May-June region a breakpoint.
We have a question or a comment really from DBU. I'll ask you, George, to reflect on it. I despise all of the political conspiracy theories regarding our president's handling of this crisis, including those who are accusing Democrats of trying to delay our nation's recovery, and all of this to ensure President Trump's removal from office during the election. What do you think of these conspiracy type theories?
I'd like to see more imaginative ones. But we're Americans and we look for answers, and if we can't find the answer, we invent one. The conspiracy theory that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent, very big in the 1950s, was there. You live in a world, you don't understand it, it's enormously complex. You want to simultaneously explain it and show how your target is vile. You come up with a story. We had the story that Andrew Jackson's wife was a hooker. That was a good one. It wasn't true even. She didn't charge. What can I say? You wind up in a situation where the most bizarre thoughts become legitimized, and there's no way to avoid it really. Yeah. But we've always had these theories.
I want to go back to what you said a few minutes ago about how we really need to reopen the economy. You sound a little bit like our lieutenant governor. And I just got a text. George Friedman assumes people individually are not afraid to die. In addition, he assumes we can keep businesses going when a huge number of people will call in sick or be afraid to travel.
Well, then you can't do it, and we're going to have a depression. And I think everybody should spend some time reading about the Greatest Generation. And one of the reasons they were so eager to go to war was because life was so horrible for them. It was a time of enormous pain. I just wrote a piece published tomorrow about Hoovervilles. People lost their apartments. People lost their houses. They lived by rivers so they could have water. They lived in cardboard shacks frequently. And this wasn't small. This was tens of thousands of people living this way through city after city. It's an extreme case, but not a unique one. It was a terrible time, and people died then too. So don't assume that industrialism in America dies a clean death. You have choices here. And if the choice is that we're going to accept a massive deconstruction, the head of the St. Louis Fed, which is the research center of the Fed system, has said that the ultimate outcome of this will be a loss of 1/2 of the American economy. Now, if you think about what that means from a personal point of view, that's huge too. So it is altogether possible that the public will not tolerate any sort of flexibility on this issue. Then they'll pay another price. But as in most things in life, there's always a price.
So we have some questions still about China, and China, perhaps is on the other side of this, and you have such good sources there and elsewhere. What are we hearing about China's reentry?
Well, essentially that the Chinese are lying. And this is kind of the wisdom that you hear from everyone, which is that what they did after the initial phase wasn't effective, and unless the virus has changed its behavior, there must be vast infections. But what they're doing is putting limits on Westerners' ability to visit certain areas, and so they have the problem. We have to understand, however, what this disease is. It infects people. Many have no symptoms. Some get quite ill but recover without help. Some, the older, have more complications, and some die. Okay, the percentage of dying is small, but not insignificant, and we have to care about that. So this is a disease that is not like the bubonic plague, wiping out 3/4 of Europe. It is somewhat different. And the Chinese, I think, are prepared to accept that more than accept the criticism if the world really knew what they were going to do.
Do you think China had a different agenda than perhaps just the people in Wuhan did not want to report to Beijing? Or what was China's agenda to not disclose and cooperate in the beginning with other countries?
Well, what first happened is that in China, junior officials are answerable to senior officials. Senior officials don't want to be blamed for anything. Therefore, they'll blame very harshly the junior official. You didn't want to be the one to go to a minister and tell him that there's a virus loose, especially when you don't understand it and you hope it'll go away. What everybody has to understand is that nobody really understood this virus very well, but it began. They still don't understand it very well, but at least they know that it's there. It was very easy for a junior official in China to see people getting sick and say, well, it's a flu, it's, something else. By the time they realized that this is not the usual, your daddy's flu, they didn't want to go and report it. So there's a built-in inefficiency in the Chinese political system, because the question is the allocation of blame. The allocation of blame can be very painful, and you don't want to be the one to have it. The best way to do is dodge the bullet.
We have two folks here who are watching who wonder, is there any probability or any chance that China was trying to weaponize this as a weapon?
Well, that's like deciding to kill somebody by shooting yourself in the head first. Um, Biological weapons aren't efficient. Chemical weapons more so, because as we see here, they spread. And if you release a biological weapon, once you release it, you don't have any control of it, which is why they're almost never used. The biggest use of biological weapons was by the Americans against Indian tribes, where they gave them smallpox-ridden blankets as gifts. But it was on a blanket. We have place, Fort Detrick in Maryland, Frederick, Maryland, which is the bio-war center for the United States. That center lost its biological warfare capability and became a biological defense capability. It was kind of realized in the 1970s that you can't have a biological weapon. And I think that's still the case. So I don't think the Chinese weaponized it, or one would think they would use it in a more targeted way than blowing up Wuhan.
Lou Pelton has this comment in question. He says, he believes you said, anger does not make history, power does. But when you look at anger in the times now with Modi, Trump, Xi, and other, I would add Bolsonaro as well, is there a new social anger across the political economy that you might identify?
Well, when you're talking about anger, Adolf Hitler is a good one. Lenin was a good one. We've always had angry people. But when they're powerless, they're just nuts. When they become elected president, they're distinguished nuts. So the point is that what I was trying to make there is that many of us feel deep anger about various things. And many times we become, angry people become leaders, but then they're constrained by all the forces around them. So you may have someone who is extremely angry, but what does he have the power to do? Also remember that the people you dislike are very angry. The people you like are passionate. And we have this little problem sometimes.
One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right?
Well, we try to be more selective than that.
Let's talk about what Jonathan Cooper wants to know about. How much of the rising cost of higher education do you think is due to rising expectations students have for services versus preferences of schools for optics and aesthetics? What's the main driver of these rising costs in universities, and what might be the easiest to change? I think you would say that professors need to teach more, but what
Well,
else?
I was a professor, and I taught 6 hours a week, half a year. It was the highest paid part-time job I've ever seen. Uh, yeah, I mean, anyone who would come into university and take a look at the work that they do would see that is a cost, and that's one of their highest costs. Now, they will say, I will say, they were doing research. I can assure you, having been hanging around with them, they weren't doing research. They were always writing the same book for 12 years. So what I'm saying is that the expectations of the professors are in internal governance more important even than the expectation of students. The professors, university is driven by professors, and they are protecting their position. And it's worked for a very long time. And many professors are extremely dedicated, capable people who nevertheless institutionally see their role in a certain way. I became cynical, but then I'm cynical about everything.
George, we have just a few more minutes, and you and I have been friends for as long as I've been at the council, which is a
Oh,
long time.
this sounds, when a guy says we've been friends, it usually is bad.
Oh, this isn't bad. I want to give you an opportunity, and this wasn't, this was not solicited by George, give you an opportunity to tell us about your firm, what makes it different. That, in fact, was one of the questions. And how can people follow you and your associates?
Our goal is to understand how the international system works, not be advocates for how it should work or anything like that. And to create a model that's predictive, which is very difficult, but we've done okay. Nations are accumulations of people, and their leaders are not nearly as important as we like to think. They're not sitting there making decisions on what to do. What they're doing mostly is feeling the pressures that are pressing in on them from various directions. So what our company does basically is lay out forecasts of how nations will behave and try to explain the latest move. And the most important part is that we try hard not to have opinions. Opinions are like noses. Everybody's got one.
And you're not
It,
based in Washington.
oh, we deliberately, I had been based in Washington. And when I reached the Maryland line, I turned around and spat, you know, leaving Washington, which is Washington is a city of opinions and it's a city of reputation. And the reputation can be good or bad or whatever, but everybody wants the next deputy assistant undersecretary of something position. They're desperate for it. And if I had stayed there, I would have been like that. But I went to Baton Rouge, Louisiana to set up a research center, the Geopolitical Studies Center, that was also funded by the government, and decided that staying in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the rest of my life was not a clear option. So having left Baton Rouge, we decided I wanted to just create a company that speaks to what used to be called the learned public. And that means not to experts in foreign policy, but people who are good citizens, care about things, knowledgeable, but are dentists, truck drivers, lawyers, whatever. No one speaks to them anymore. And the loss of that class of people is catastrophic to democracy.
And you have some materials that people can access for free on the website, or is it all with a
Absolutely.
paywall?
Before I go any further with this, yes.
Yeah.
They can definitely get some free things, and then we try to squeeze money out of you.
And then and you do that well. Before we close, George, I suspect and hope you have a copy of your book in front of you,
I
unless you've
do.
memorized it. And I'd like you to read the second to the last paragraph on the last page. I think that's a good way
Everybody,
for we to close, and then I have just a few concluding notes.
and for everybody, there's nothing more annoying to an author to ever have to look at the book again in any way, shape, or form. America is a country in which the storm is essential to clear the way for the calm. Sorry, I've got something in my eye. Okay. Because Americans obsessed with the present. I can't read because my contact lens just blew out.
I just thought it was so emotional. I'll read it for you.
Thank you.
America is a country in which the storm is essential to clear the way for the calm. Because Americans obsessed with the present and future have difficulty remembering the past, they will all believe that there has never been a time as uncivil and tense as this one. They will wait for the collapse of all things and loathe all those who produced it, which will be those with whom they disagree. It will be a time of self-righteous, self-certainty, hatred, and sometimes murderous for those they despise. And then the patterns of history work their way through using the raw material available. American power in the world will sustain itself because the power of a country like the United States, a vast economy, and military and seductive culture does not decline because it is hated. All empires are hated and envied. Power is not diminished by either. And as I said, that's the second to last paragraph, and the rest of the book to get there is very interesting. George, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for being with us today. And I want to remind our listeners that they can pick up a copy of George Friedman's book, The Storm Before the Calm, by going to interabangbooks.com, and they'll be able to send it to you right away with free shipping. Let me also mention that this coming Friday, we'll be having a discussion with Dion Searcy about this book, In Pursuit of Disobedient Women. Dion was based in Senegal for the New York Times, and it's a book that talks about the politics of Senegal, a lot about Boko Haram, but also what it's like working for the New York Times and the pressures and opportunities that you have when you're working for one of the most important papers in the United States. Also, if you're interested in being a member of the World Affairs Council, I hope you'll go to our website at dfwworld.org/passport, and you won't be surprised that we're offering a 20% discount. Membership, especially at this time, if you like what we're doing, is so important for us to continue to do our work. Thank you so much for listening, and hope to see you this Friday. And we have lots of time to read, so pick up George's book. Good afternoon, everyone.